Hans-Joachim Marseille was a Luftwaffe fighter pilot and flying ace during World War II. He is noted for his aerial battles during the North African campaign and his Bohemian lifestyle. One of the most successful fighter pilots, he was nicknamed the Star of Africa. Marseille claimed all but 7 of his official 158 victories against the British Commonwealth's Desert Air Force over North Africa, flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter for his entire combat career. No other pilot claimed as many Western Allied aircraft as Marseille. Marseille, of French Huguenot ancestry, joined the Luftwaffe in 1938. At the age of 20 he graduated from one of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilot schools just in time to participate in the Battle of Britain, without notable success. A charming person, he had such a busy nightlife that sometimes he was too tired to be allowed to fly the next morning. As a result, he was transferred to another unit, which relocated to North Africa in April 1941. Under the guidance of his new commander, who recognized the latent potential in the young officer, Marseille quickly developed his abilities as a fighter pilot. He reached a zenith of his fighter pilot career on September 1, 1942, when during the course of 3 combat sorties he claimed 17 enemy fighters shot down, earning him the Ritterkreuz mit Eichenlaub, Schwertern und Brillanten. Only 29 days later, Marseille was killed in a flying accident, when he was forced to abandon his fighter due to engine failure. After he exited the smoke-filled cockpit, Marseille's chest struck the vertical stabilizer of his aircraft. The blow either killed him instantly or incapacitated him so that he was unable to open his parachute. Early life: Hans-Joachim Jochen Walter Rudolf Siegfried Marseille was born to Charlotte and Hauptmann Siegfried Georg Martin Marseille, a family with paternal Huguenot ancestry, in Berlin-Charlottenburg, Berliner Straße 164 on December 13, 1919 at 11:45 p.m. As a child, he was physically weak, and he nearly died from a serious case of influenza. His father Siegfried was an army officer during World War I, and later left the armed forces to join the Berlin police force. Siegfried later rejoined the army in 1933, and was promoted to general in 1935. Promoted again, he attained the rank of General Major on July 1, 1941. He served on the Eastern Front from the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. Siegfried Marseille was killed by partisans near Pietrikow on January 29, 1944. He was buried in the cemetery of Slage. Hans-Joachim also had a younger sister, Ingeborg. While on sick leave in Athens at the end of December 1941, he was summoned to Berlin by a telegram from his mother. Upon arriving home, he learned his sister had been slain by a jealous lover. Hans-Joachim never recovered emotionally from this blow. When Marseille was still a young child, his parents divorced and his mother subsequently married a police official named Reuter. Marseille initially assumed the name of his stepfather at school, but he reverted to his father's name of Marseille in adulthood. He acquired the reputation of being a rebel from a lack of discipline, a characteristic that would plague him early on in his Luftwaffe career. Marseille also had a difficult relationship with his natural father, whom he refused to visit in Hamburg for some time after the divorce. Eventually he attempted a reconciliation with his father, who subsequently introduced him to the nightlife that was to initially hamper his military career during his early years in the Luftwaffe. However, the rapprochement with his father did not last and he did not see him again thereafter. Marseille attended the 12th Volksschule Berlin, and from the age of 10, the Prinz-Heinrich Gymnasium in Berlin's Paragraph-Neuburg. He was considered to be a lazy student at first, and was constantly playing pranks and getting into trouble. Toward the end of his school years he started to take his education more seriously and qualified as one of the youngest to achieve his Abitur, graduating in early 1938. Marseille then expressed his desire to become a flying officer. Entry into the Luftwaffe. Although not athletic in physique, Marseille received a good report for a term with the Reichsarbeitsdienst ABTLG. 177th and Osterholz-Scharmbeck near Bremen, between April 4 and September 24, 1938. He joined Luftwaffe on November 7, 1938, as a Fernjunker and received his military basic training in Quedlinburg in the Herz region. On March 1, 1939, Marseille was transferred to the Luftkriegsschule 4 near Far-1/4 Rustenfeldbruck. Among his classmates was Werner Schreeparagrapher. Schreeparagrapher reports that Marseille was often in breach of military discipline. Consequently, Marseille was ordered to stay on base while his classmates were on weekend leave. Quite frequently Marseille ignored this and left Schreeparagrapher a note, "Went out. Please take my chores." On one occasion, while performing a slow circuit, Marseille broke away and performed an imaginary weaving dog fight. He was reprimanded by his commanding officer, Hauptmann Müller-Moser, and taken off flying duties and his promotion to Gefreiter postponed. Soon after, during a cross-country flight, he landed on a quiet stretch of Autobahn and ran behind a tree to relieve himself. Some farmers came to inquire if he needed assistance, but by the time they arrived Marseille was on his way, and they were blown back by his slipstream. Infuriated, the farmers reported the matter and Marseille was again suspended from flying. Those he graduated with had been made full officers by early 1940, while Marseille's indiscipline left him with the rank of Oberfahrkranzich at the end of 1941. Marseille completed his training at Jagdleiterschule 5 in Winschishot, to which he was posted on November 1, 1939. Jagdleiterschule 5 at the time was under the command of the World War I flying ace and recipient of the Paul Aumar copyright Rittward Ritter von Schleich. One of his teachers at the Jagdleiterschule 5 was the Austro-Hungarian World War I ace Julius Aragi. Marseille graduated from Jagdleiterschule 5 with an outstanding evaluation on July 18, 1940 and was assigned to Erger-Currenziensangstjagdtrupp Merseburg. Marseille's unit was assigned to air defense duty over the lunar plant from the outbreak of war until the fall of France. On August 10, 1940 he was assigned to IJAGD Lugerschwader II, based in Calais Mark, to begin operations over Britain and again received an outstanding evaluation, this time by his Hauptmann and Gruppen commander, Herbert Ihlerfeld. World War II Battle of Britain In his first dogfight over England on August 24, 1940, Marseille was involved in a 4-minute battle with a skilled opponent. He defeated his opponent by pulling up into a tight chandelle, to gain an altitude advantage before diving and firing. The British fighter was struck in the engine, pitching over and diving into the English Channel. This was Marseille's first victory. Marseille was then engaged from above by more enemy fighters. By pushing his aircraft into a steep dive then pulling up meters above the water, Marseille escaped from the machine gun fire of his opponents, skipping away over the waves. "I made a clean break. No one followed me and I returned to Leeuwarden." Marseille was based near Calais, not Leeuwarden. Marseille did not take any pleasure in this victory and found it difficult to accept the realities of aerial combat. On his second sortie, he scored another victory, and by the 15th September 1940, had claimed his fourth victory. Marseille became an ace on September 18 after claiming a fifth enemy aircraft. While returning from a bomber escort mission on September 23, 1940 flying work number 5094, his engine fell 10 miles off Cap Grisnez after combat damage sustained over Dover. Pilot Officer George Benians from 41 Squadron may have shot Marseille down. According to another source, WNR 5094 was destroyed in this engagement by Robert Stanford Tuck, who had pursued a Bf 109 to that location and whose pilot was rescued by a He-59 naval aircraft. Marseille is the only German airman known to have been rescued by a He-59 on that day and in that location. Tuck's official claim was for a Bf 109 destroyed off Grisnez at 9:45 the only pilot to submit a claim in that location. Marseille tried to radio his position but was forced to bail out over the sea. He paddled around in the water for 3 hours before being rescued by a Heinkel He-59 float plane based at Schellingoude. Severely worn out and suffering from exposure, he was sent to a field hospital. JAGD/LG2 claimed 3 aerial victories for the loss of 4 Bf 109s that day. Marseille was in serious trouble when arriving back at the airfield. He had abandoned his leader Staffelkapiter Currency N. Adolf Bull, who was shot down and killed. He received a stern rebuke and final warning from Herbert Eilefeld, during which he tore up his flight evaluations with a visibly upset Marseille looking on. Other pilots were voicing their dissent concerning Marseille. Because of his alienation of other pilots, his arrogance and unapologetic nature, Eilefeld would eventually dismiss Marseille from LG2. Another account recalled how Marseille once ignored an order to turn back from a fight when outnumbered by 2-1, but seeing an enemy aircraft closing on his wing leader, Marseille broke formation and shot the attacking aircraft down. Expecting nothing but a well-done jockin, when he landed, he was thoroughly criticized for his actions, receiving 3 days of confinement for failing to carry out an order. Days later, Marseille was passed over for promotion and was now the sole Fahrkürency HNRICH in the Geschwader. This was a humiliation for him, suspecting that his abilities were being suppressed so the squadron leaders could take all the glory in the air. Shortly afterwards, in early October 1940, after having claimed 7 aerial victories, all them flying with I.JAGD/LG2, Marseille was transferred to 4/Jagdgeschwader 52, flying alongside the likes of Johannes Stinhoff and Gerard Barkhahn. He wrote off 4 aircraft as a result of operations during this period. Stinhoff, later recalled, "Marseille was extremely handsome. He was a very gifted pilot, but he was unreliable. He had girlfriends everywhere, and they kept him so busy that he was sometimes so worn out that he had to be grounded. His sometime irresponsible way of conducting his duties was the main reason I fired him. But he had irresistible charm. As punishment for insubordination, rumored to be his penchant for American jazz music, womanizing and an overt playboy lifestyle and inability to fly as a wingman, Stinhoff transferred Marseille to Jagdgeschwader 27 on December 24, 1940. When he joined his new unit, it was difficult to foresee his outstanding career. His new grouping commander, Duart Newman, later recalled, his hair was too long and he brought with him a list of disciplinary punishments as long as your arm. He was tempestuous, temperamental and unruly. 30 years later, he would have been called a playboy. Nevertheless, Newman quickly recognized Marseille's potential as a pilot. He stated in an interview, "Marseille could only be one of two, either a disciplinary problem or a great fighter pilot." Jagdgeschwader 27 was soon relocated to North Africa. Arrival in North Africa Marseille's unit briefly saw action during the invasion of Yugoslavia, deployed to Zagreb on April 10, 1941, before transferring to Africa. On April 20 on his flight from Tripoli to his front airstrip, Marseille's Bf 109 developed engine trouble and he had to make a forced landing in the desert short of his destination. His squadron departed the scene after they had ensured that he had got down safely. Marseille continued his journey, first hitchhiking on an Italian truck, then, finding this too slow, he tried his luck at an airstrip in vain. Finally he made his way to the general in charge of a supply depot on the main route to the front, and convinced him that he should be available for operations next day. Marseille's character appealed to the general and he put at his disposal his own Opel Admiral, complete with chauffeur. "You can pay me back by getting 50 victories, Marseille," were his parting words. Nevertheless he caught up with his squadron and arrived on April 21. He scored 2 more victories on 23 and 28 April, his first in the North African campaign. However, on April 23, Marseille himself was shot down during his third sortie of that day by Sous Lieutenant James Dennis, a Free French pilot with No. 73 Squadron RAF, flying a Hawker Hurricane. Marseille's Bf 109 received almost 30 hits in the cockpit area, and 3 or 4 shattered the canopy. As Marseille was leaning forward, the rounds missed him by inches. Marseille managed to crash-land his fighter. Just a month later, records show that James Dennis shot down Marseille again on May 21, 1941. Marseille engaged Dennis, but overshot his target. A turning dog fight ensued, in which Dennis once again bested Marseille. Newman encouraged Marseille to self-train to improve his abilities. By this time, he had crashed or damaged another 4 Bf 109E aircraft, including a tropicalized aircraft he was ferrying on April 23, 1941. Marseille's kill rate was low, and he went from June to August without a victory. He was further frustrated after damage forced him to land on two occasions, once on June 14, 1941 and again after he was hit by ground fire over Tobruk and was forced to land blind. His tactic of diving into enemy formations often found him under fire from all directions, resulting in his aircraft being damaged beyond repair. Consequently, Dwight Newman was losing his patience. Marseille persisted, and created a unique self-training program for himself, both physical and tactical, which resulted not just in outstanding situational awareness, marksmanship and confident control of the aircraft, but also in a unique attack tactic that preferred a high-angle deflection shooting attack and shooting at the target's front from the side, instead of the common method of chasing an aircraft and shooting at it directly from behind. Marseille often practiced these tactics on the way back from missions with his comrades. Marseille became known as a master of deflection shooting. As Marseille began to claim enemy aircraft regularly, on occasion he would organize the welfare of the downed pilot personally, driving out to remote crash sites to rescue downed Allied airmen. On September 13, 1941, Marseille shot down Pat Byers of the Royal Australian Air Force No. 451 Squadron. Marseille flew to Byers Airfield and dropped a note informing the Australians of his condition and treatment. He returned several days later to second the first note with news of Byers' death. Marseille repeated these sorties after being warned by Newman that GAR paragraph ring had forbade any more flights of this kind. After the war, Marseille's JG-27 comrade Werner Schrapparagrapher stated that Marseille attempted these gestures as penance for a group that loved shooting down aircraft, but not killing a man. We tried to separate the two. Marseille allowed us that escape, our penance I suppose. Finally on September 24, 1941, his practice came to fruition, with his first multiple victory sortie, claiming 4 Hurricanes of No. 1 Squadron, South African Air Force. By mid-December, he had reached 25 victories and was duly awarded the German Cross in Gold. His staff was rotated to Germany in November-December 1941 to convert to the Bf 109 F4/Trop, the variant that was described as the ex-Burton mount. These victories represented his 23rd victory. The Star of Africa . Marseille always strove to improve his abilities. He worked to strengthen his legs and abdominal muscles, to help him tolerate the extreme G-forces of air combat. Marseille also drank an abnormal amount of milk and shunned sunglasses, to improve his eyesight. To counter German fighter attacks, the Allied pilots flew Lovebury circles. The tactic was effective and dangerous as a pilot attacking this formation could find himself constantly in the sights of enemy pilots. Marseille often dived at high speed into the middle of these enemy defensive formations from either above or below, executing a tight turn and firing a 2-second deflection shot to destroy an enemy aircraft. The successes Marseille had begun to become readily apparent in early 1942. He claimed his 37 Euro 40th victories on 8 February 1942 and 41 Euro 44th victories 4 days later, which earned him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross that same month for 46 victories. Marseille attacked under conditions many considered unfavorable, but his marksmanship allowed him to make an approach fast enough to escape the return fire of the 2 aircraft flying on either flank of the target. Marseille's excellent eyesight made it possible for him to spot the enemy before he was spotted, allowing him to take the appropriate action and maneuver into position for an attack. In combat, Marseille's unorthodox methods led him to operate in a small leader wingman unit, which he believed to be the safest and most effective way of fighting in the high visibility conditions of the North African skies. Marseille worked alone in combat, keeping his wingman at a safe distance so he would not collide or fire on him in error. In a dogfight, particularly when attacking Allied aircraft in a Lovebury circle, Marseille would often favor dramatically reducing the throttle and even lowering the flaps to reduce speed and shorten his turn radius, rather than the standard procedure of using full throttle throughout. Emile Clade said that none of the other pilots could do this effectively, preferring instead to dive on single opponents at speed so as to escape if anything went wrong. Clade said of Marseille's tactics. Marseille developed his own special tactics, which differed significantly from the methods of most other pilots. He had to fly very slowly. He even took it to the point where he had to operate his landing flaps as not to fall down, because, of course, he had to fly his curve more tightly than the upper defensive circle. He and his fighter were one unit, and he was in command of that aircraft like no one else. Friedrich Carr paragraph RNER also recognized this as unique. Shooting in a curve is the most difficult thing a pilot can do. The enemy flies in a defensive circle, that means they are already lying in a curve and the attacking fighter has to fly into this defensive circle. By pulling his aircraft right around, his curve radius must be smaller, but if he does that, his target disappears in most cases below his wings. So he cannot see it anymore and has to proceed simply by instinct. His success as a fighter pilot also led to promotions and more responsibility as an officer. May 1, 1942 saw him receive an unusually early promotion to Oberleutnant followed by appointment to Staffelkapitän currency NF3/JG27 on June 8, 1942, thus succeeding Oberleutnant Gerhard Homuth who took command of I/JG27. In a conversation with his friend Hans-Arnold Stahlschmidt, Marseille commented on his style, and his idea of air-to-air combat. I often experience combat as it should be. I see myself in the middle of a British, sick swarm, firing from every position and never getting caught. Our aircraft are basic elements, Stahlschmidt, which have got to be mastered. You've got to be able to shoot from any position. From left or right turns, out of a roll, on your back, whenever. Only this way can you develop your own particular tactics. Attack tactics, that the enemy simply cannot anticipate during the course of the battle. A series of unpredictable movements and actions, never the same, always stemming from the situation at hand. Only then can you plunge into the middle of an enemy swarm and blow it up from the inside. Marseille had a narrow escape on May 13, 1942, when his Bf 109 was damaged during a dogfight with 12 Kitty Hawks from No. 3 Squadron RAAF, southeast of Gazala and over the Gulf of Bomba. With a wingman, Marseille bounced the Kitty Hawks. After he downed one of the Australian pilots, Flying Officer Graham Pace in AL-172, Marseille's Bf 109 took hits in the oil tank and propeller, likely from Flying Officer Jeff Chinkin, who reported damaging one of the Messerschmitts. Marseille nevertheless managed to shoot down another Kitty Hawk, before nursing his overheating aircraft back to base. The repairs to Marseille's Bf 109 took 2 days. The aerial victories were recorded as numbers 57 to 58. Weeks later, on May 30, Marseille performed another mercy mission after witnessing his 65th Victoria pilot officer Graham George Buckland of No. 250 Squadron RAF strike the tailplane of his fighter and fall to his death when the parachute did not open. After landing he drove out to the crash site. The P-40 had landed over Allied lines but they found the dead pilot within German territory. Marseille marked his grave, collected his papers and verified his identity, then flew to Buckland's airfield to deliver a letter of regret. Buckland died 2 days before his 21st birthday. His attack method to break up formations, which he perfected, resulted in a high proportion of kills, and in rapid, multiple victories per attack. On June 3, 1942, Marseille attacked alone a formation of 16 Curtiss P-40 fighters and shot down 6 aircraft of No. 5 Squadron SAAF, 5 of them in 6 minutes, including 3 aces, Robin Pear, Cecil Golding and André Botha. This success inflated his score further, recording his 75th victories. Marseille was awarded the Ritterkreuz mit Ehrenlaub on June 6, 1942. His wingman Rainer Paar paragraph TTGEN, nicknamed Flagen des Czar currency HLWERK said of this fight. All the enemy were shot down by Marseille in a turning dogfight. As soon as he shot, he needed only to glance at the enemy plane. His pattern of gunfire began at the front, the engine's nose, and consistently ended in the cockpit. How he was able to do this not even he could explain. With every dogfight he would throttle back as far as possible. This enabled him to fly tighter turns. His expenditure of ammunition in this air battle was 360 rounds. Paragrapher did however, place Marseille's methods into context. He was the most amazing and ingenious combat pilot I ever saw. He was also very lucky on many occasions. He thought nothing of jumping into a fight outnumbered 10-1, often alone, with us trying to catch up to him. He violated every cardinal rule of fighter combat. He abandoned all the rules. On June 17, 1942, Marseille claimed his 100th aerial victory. He was the 11th Luftwaffe pilot to achieve the century mark. Marseille then returned to Germany for 2 months' leave and the following day was awarded the Ritterkreuz mit Ehrendoktor. On August 6, he began his journey back to North Africa accompanied by his fiancé copywriter Hans-Joachim Pper. On August 13, he met Benito Mussolini in Rome and was presented with the highest Italian military award for bravery, the Medaglia d'Oro al Valor Militare. While in Italy, Marseille disappeared for some time, prompting the German authorities to compile a missing persons report, submitted by the Gestapo head in Rome, Herbert Capella. He was finally located. According to rumors, he had run off with an Italian girl and was eventually persuaded to return to his unit. Unusually, nothing was ever said about the incident and no repercussions were visited upon Marseille for this indiscretion. Leaving his fiancée copywriter in Rome, Marseille returned to combat duties on August 1. 23 September 1942 was Marseille's most successful day, destroying 17 enemy aircraft, and September would see him claim 54 victories, his most productive month. The 17 enemy aircraft shot down included 8 in 10 minutes. As a result of this feat, he was presented with a Type 82 Volkswagen car 1/4 Belgian by an Italian Regia Aeronautica squadron, on which his Italian comrades had painted Otto. This was the most aircraft from Western Allied air forces shot down by a single pilot in one day. Only one pilot, Emile Bully-Lang, on November 4, 1943, would better this score, against the Soviet Air Force on the Eastern Front. On September 3, 1942, Marseille claimed 6 victories but was hit by fire from the British-Canadian ace James Francis Edwards. 3 days later, Edwards likely killed Gar 1/4 Entila Steinhausen, a friend of Marseille. The next day, September 7, 1942, another close friend, Hans-Arnold Stahlschmidt, was posted missing in action. These personal losses weighed heavily on Marseille's mind along with his family tragedy. It was noted he barely spoke and became more morose in the last weeks of his life. The strain of combat also induced consistent sleepwalking at night and other symptoms that could be construed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Marseille never remembered these events. Marseille continued scoring multiple victories throughout September, including 7 on September 15. Between 16 and 25 September, Marseille failed to increase his score due to a fractured arm, sustained in a forced landing soon after the 15 September mission. As a result, he had been forbidden to fly by Dwight Newman. But the same day, Marseille borrowed the Macchi C-200-296 Euro-10 of the Italian ace Tenente Emanuele Annini, from 96 Squadriglia, 9 degree Gruppo, 4 degree Stormo, based at Fuca, for a test flight. But the one-off flight ended in a wheels-up landing, when the German ace accidentally switched the engine off, as the throttle control in Italian aircraft was opposite to that of the German aircraft. Marseille had nearly surpassed his friend Hans-Arnold Stahlschmidt's score of 59 victories in just 5 weeks. However, the massive material superiority of the Allies meant the strain placed on the outnumbered German pilots was now severe. At this time, the strength of German fighter units was 112 aircraft against the British muster of some 800 machines. Marseille was becoming physically exhausted by the frenetic pace of combat. After his last combat on September 26, Marseille was reportedly on the verge of collapse after a 15-minute battle with a formation of Spitfires, during which he scored his 7th victory of that day. Of particular note was Marseille's 158th claim. After landing in the afternoon of the 26th September 1942, he was physically exhausted. Several accounts allude to his squadron members being visibly shocked at Marseille's physical state. Marseille, according to his own post-battle accounts, had been engaged by a Spitfire pilot in an intense dogfight that began at high altitude and descended to low level. Marseille recounted how both he and his opponent strove to get onto the tail of the other. Both succeeded and fired, but each time the pursued managed to turn the table on their attacker. Finally, with only 15 minutes of fuel remaining, he climbed into the sun. The RAF fighter followed and was caught in the glare. Marseille executed a tight turn and roll, fired from 100 meters range. The Spitfire caught fire and shed a wing. It crashed into the ground with the pilot still inside. Marseille wrote, "That was the toughest adversary I have ever had. His turns were fabulous. I thought it would be my last fight." Unfortunately, the pilot and his unit remain unidentified. Aircraft The following Bf-109E-7 aircraft are among those that Marseille flew: Work number 3579, sustained 50% damage on September 2, 1940 in aerial combat and crash-landed near Calais. Mark WNR 5597, sustained 75% damage on September 11, 1940 in aerial combat and made an emergency landing near Wissant. WNR 5094, sustained 100% damage on September 23, 1940. Marseille bailed out after aerial combat near Dover. WNR 4091, sustained 35% damage on September 28, 1940. Marseille made an emergency landing after engine failure near the Copyrightville. WNR 1259, sustained 80% damage on April 20, 1941. Marseille made an emergency landing after engine failure near Keila. WNR 5160, sustained 100% damage on April 23, 1941. Marseille made an emergency landing after combat and belly landing near Tobruk. WNR 1567, sustained 40% damage on May 21, 1941 in aerial combat and made an emergency landing near Tobruk. Marseille flew 4 different Bf-109 F4/Z aircraft, work number 12593, in which his score rose to 50 on February 23, 1942, WNR 10059, with 68 victory bars on the rudder. On September 15, 1942, this aircraft lost a wing in a mid-air collision when its pilot Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann of 3/JG-27 collided with a Bf-109 piloted by Unteroffizier Heinrich Pien of 5/JG-27. Unteroffizier Pien was killed in the resulting crash. Lieutenant Hoffmann bailed out only to succumb to his injuries 5 weeks later. WNR 10137, with the number 70 within an open-topped wreath and 31 victory bars on the rudder, his final F4/top. WNR 8673 with the early F variant rear fuselage horizontal support bars welded along the lower rear fuselage seam joining the fin rudder and the stabilizer elevators to the next forward fuselage section, a black outlined yellow 14, and, on the rudder, 100 enclosed within a wreath, atop 51 victory bars. Death equals, the 2 missions of September 26, 1942 had been flown in Bf-109 G2/top. In one of which Marseille had shot down 7 enemy aircraft. The first 6 of these machines were to replace the Grupp's Bf-109 FS. All had been allocated to Marseille's 3 staff. Marseille had previously ignored orders to use these new aircraft because of its high engine failure rate, but on the orders of General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Marseille reluctantly obeyed. One of these machines, WKNR 14256, was to be the final aircraft Marseille flew. Over the next 3 days Marseille staff was rested and taken off flying duties. On September 28 Marseille received a telephone call from General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel asking to return with him to Berlin. Hitler was to make a speech at the Berlin Sportpalast on September 30 and Rommel and Marseille were to attend. Marseille rejected this offer, citing that he was needed at the front and had already taken 3 months vacation that year. Marseille also revealed he wanted to take leave at Christmas, to marry his fiancée copyrightee Hanlise Car 1/4 PPER. On September 30, 1942, Hauptmann Marseille was leading his staff on a Stuka escort mission, covering the withdrawal of the group and relieving the outward escort, 3/Jagdgeschwader 53, which had been deployed to support JG-27 in Africa. Marseille's flight was vectored onto enemy aircraft in the vicinity, but the enemy withdrew and did not take up combat. Marseille vectored the heading and height of the formation to Newman, who directed 3/JG-27 to engage. Marseille heard 8/JG-27 leader Werner Schra claim a Spitfire over the radio at 10:30. While returning to base, his new Messerschmitt Bf 109G2/Trop's cockpit began to fill with smoke. Blinded and half asphyxiated, he was guided back to German lines by his wingman, Jost Schlang, and Lieutenant Rainer TTGEN. Upon reaching friendly lines, Yellow 14 had lost power and was drifting lower and lower. TTGEN called out after about 10 minutes that they had reached the White Mosque of Sidi Abdel Rahman, and were thus within friendly lines. At this point, Marseille deemed his aircraft no longer flyable and decided to bail out, his last words to his comrades being, "I've got to get out now, I can't stand it any longer." Duarte Newman was personally directing the mission from the command post. "I was at the command post and listening to the radio communication between the pilots. I realized immediately something serious had happened. I knew they were still in flight and that they were trying to bring Marseille over the lines into our territory and that his aircraft was emitting a lot of smoke." His staff, which had been flying a tight formation around him, peeled away to give him the necessary room to maneuver. Marseille rolled his aircraft onto its back, the standard procedure for bailout, but due to the smoke and slight disorientation, he failed to notice that the aircraft had entered a steep dive and was now traveling at a considerably faster speed. He worked his way out of the cockpit and into the rushing air only to be carried backwards by the slipstream, the left side of his chest striking the vertical stabilizer of his fighter, either killing him instantly or rendering him unconscious to the point that he could not deploy his parachute. He fell almost vertically, hitting the desert floor 7 kilometers south of Sidi Abdel Rahman. As it transpired, a gaping 40 centimeters hole had been made in his parachute and the canopy had spilled out, but after recovering the body, the parachute release handle was still unsafe, revealing Marseille had not even attempted to open it. Whilst checking the body, Oberarzt Dr. Bick, the regimental doctor for the 115th Panzergrenadier Regiment, noted Marseille's wristwatch had stopped at exactly 11:42 a.m. Dr. Bick had been the first to reach the crash site, having been stationed just to the rear of the Ford mine defenses. He had also witnessed Marseille's fatal fall. In his autopsy report, Dr. Bick stated, "The pilot lay on his stomach as if asleep. His arms were hidden beneath his body. As I came closer, I saw a pool of blood that had issued from the side of his crushed skull. Brain matter was exposed. I turned the dead pilot over onto his back and opened the zipper of his flight jacket, saw the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and I knew immediately who this was." The paybook also told me, "Oberleutnant Ludwig Franziskett collected the body from the desert. Hans-Joachim Marseille lay in state in the staff sick bay, his comrades coming to pay their respects throughout the day. As a tribute they put on the record Rumba Azul that he had enjoyed listening to. It played over and over until the close of day." Marseille's funeral took place on October 1, 1942 at the Heroes Cemetery in Dana, with General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring and Duarte Newman delivering a eulogy. The last entry in his flight book by Duarte Newman read, "Flight duration 54 minutes, time of landing Black Cross. Took to parachute 7 kilometers south of Sidi Abdel Rahman. Remarks, engine damage. Flights 1 Euro 482, 388 combat flights and a total of 158 kills, certified in the field September 30, 1942. An inquiry into the crash was hastily set up. The Commission's report concluded that the crash was caused by damage to the differential gear, which caused an oil leak. Then a number of teeth broke off the spur wheel and ignited the oil. Sabotage or human error was ruled out. The aircraft, WNR 14256, was ferried to the unit via Bari, Italy. The mission that ended in its destruction was its first mission. Impact of Marseille's death. JG-27 was moved out of Africa for about a month because of the impact Marseille's death had on morale. The deaths of two other German aces, Gar-1-Quarter-Entelier Steinhausen and Marseille's friend Hans-Arnold Stahlschmidt, just 3 weeks earlier reduced spirits to an all-time low. One biographer suggests these consequences were instigated by a failure in the command style of Marseille, although it was not entirely within his control. The more success Marseille had, the more his staff relied on him to carry the greater share of aerial victories claimed by the unit. So his death, when it came, was something which JG-27 had seemingly not prepared for. Historians Hans Ring and Christopher Shawes also point to the fact that Marseille's promotions were based on personal success rates more than any other reason, and other pilots did not get to score air victories, let alone become expert in themselves. They flew support as the maestro showed them how it was done, and often held back from attacking enemy aircraft to build his score still higher. As a result, there was no other expert to step into Marseille's shoes if he was killed. Duarte Newman explained. This handicap, that very few pilots scored, was partially overcome by the morale effect on the whole Geschwader of the success of pilots like Marseille. In fact, most of the pilots in Marseille's staff acted in secondary role as escort to the master. Still Newman, who was himself one of the Luftwaffe Euro's most able operational leaders, in the assessment of his subordinate commander's quality was not necessarily easily imitable. As a fighter pilot, Marseille was absolutely supreme. Above all, he possessed lightning reflexes and could make a quicker judgment in a bigger orbit than anyone else. Marseille was unique. Marseille's impact on enemy fighter pilots and their morale is unclear. Andrew Thomas quoted pilot officer Bert Houle of No. 213 Squadron RAF. He was an extremely skilled pilot and a deadly shot. It was a helpless feeling to be continually bounced, and to do so little about it. Robert Tate on the other hand is skeptical that enemy pilots would have been familiar with each other. How well was Marseille known to DAF personnel in the desert? Apparently not so well. Although there is little indication that some Allied pilots may have heard of Marseille, this information did not readily make its way down to Allied squadrons. Fanciful stories abound of how pilots knew of one another and hoped to duel with each other in the skies. This was more than likely not the case. Memorials. Hans-Joachim Marseille appeared 4 times in the Deutsche Wochenschau. The first time on Wednesday 17 February 1942 when Oberst Galland, the General der Jagdliga, visited an airport in the desert. The second time on Wednesday 1 July 1942 when Marseille travelled to Rastenburg to receive the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords from Adolf Hitler. The third time on Wednesday 9 September 1942 announcing Marseille's 17 aerial victories from September 1, 1942 and that he had been awarded the diamonds to his Knight's Cross. His last appearance dates from Wednesday 30 September 1942 showing Hauptmann Marseille visiting Erwin Rommel. A wartime pyramid was constructed by Italian engineers at the site of Marseille's fall but over time it decayed. On October 22, 1989, Duarte Newman and other JG-27 survivors in cooperation with the Egyptian government, erected a new pyramid that stands there to this day. In the weeks following Marseille's death morale was low. In an attempt to improve morale Oberleutnant Fritz Dettmann persuaded Duarte Newman to rename 3/JG-27 the Marseille staff. His grave bears a one-word epitaph, undefeated. It is understood that after the war, Hans-Joachim Marseille's remains were brought from Dana and reinterred in the Memorial Gardens at Tobruk. It was there that his mother visited his grave in 1954. His remains are now in a small clay coffin bearing the number 4133. In 1957, a German film, Der Stern von Afrika directed by Alfred Weir-Denman, was made starring Joachim Hansen as Hans-Joachim Marseille. On October 24, 1975, the Bundeswehr Luftwaffe's Wettersenappen Barracks was renamed the Marseille Barracks. The memorial of the Reuter Marseille family can be found in the graveyard in Berlin, Altsche Paragraph Neuburg. the left side bears the insignia. The tail rudder of his second-to-last Messerschmitt Bf 109 F4/Trop, now bearing 158 victory marks, is on display at Luftwaffe Museum der Bundeswehr in Berlin-Gatow. It had initially been given to his family as a gift by Hermann Gar Paragraph-Ring and was donated to the museum in the 1970s. 25 years after Marseille's death, fighter pilot veterans of World War II gathered to honor Marseille at an international fighter pilots meeting on October 8, 1967 at Far 1 Rustenfeldbruck. Attending this meeting were fighter pilots from 6 different countries, including Erich Hartmann, Robert Stanford Tuck, Adolf Galland, Gar 1 Nther and Mike Martin, who was shot down by Marseille on June 3, 1942. The guests of honor at this meeting were Marseille's mother, Frau Charlotte Reuter Marseille, and his ex-fiancé copywriter Han Lies. The 16th Deutsches Afrikakorps reunion took place on September 2, 1984 in Stuttgart. The German Bundesregierung invited as guest of honor Corporal Matthew Pielteku from South Africa. Matthew, alias Matthias to everyone in JG-27, was a black South African soldier taken prisoner of war by German troops on the morning of June 21, 1941 at Fortress Tobruk. Matthias initially worked as a volunteer driver with 3. Staffler then befriended Marseille and became his domestic helper in Africa. Victory claims and notable actions. FAR currency HNRICH. Hans-Joachim Marseille was transferred to his first combat assignment with the I.JAGD/Lugerschwade 2 at the time stationed at Calais Mark on Sunday 10 August 1940. 2 days later he arrived at this unit on August 12, 1940. He was assigned to the 1. Staffel of this group. Staffel Kapita currency N was Oberleutnant Adolf Buhl. One of the Schwarm for 1 quarter rare was Oberfeldwebel Helmut Goedet, to whom Marseille was assigned as wingman. Marseille already flew his very first combat mission on the next day, Wednesday 13 August 1940, and claimed his first aerial victory on August 24, 1940. In over little more than 2 years he would amass another 157 aerial victories. His 158 aerial victories were claimed in 382 combat missions. This and the unregistered trademark indicates those days which made Marseille an ace in a day, a term which designates a fighter pilot who has shot down 5 or more airplanes in a single day. This indicates that the aerial combat report is missing from the German Federal Archives. This indicates that Australian historian Russell Brown has expressed doubt regarding the veracity of Marseille's claims. Marseille's 151 claims in North Africa included 101 Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk Kitty Hawk fighters, 30 Hawker Hurricane fighters, 16 Supermarine Spitfire fighters, 2 Martin A-30 Baltimore bombers, 1 Bristol Blenheim bomber, and 1 Martin Maryland bomber. The German Federal Archives still hold records for 109 of Marseille aerial victories. A further biographer of Marseille, Walter Wang 1 quarter BBE, has made an attempt to link these records to Allied units, squadrons and when possible even to individual pilots, in order to verify the claims as much as possible. Dispute over claims equals. Some serious discrepancies between Allied squadron records and German claims have caused some historians and Allied veterans to question the accuracy of Marseille's official victories, in addition to those of JG-27 as a whole. Attention is often focused on the 26 claims made by JG-27 on September 1, 1942, of which 17 were claimed by Marseille alone. Another biographer, Franz Karowski, claims that 24 of the 26 victories were verified through Allied records after the war. A USAF historian, Major Robert Tate states, for years, many British historians and militarists refused to admit that they had lost any aircraft that day in North Africa. Careful review of records however do show that the British and South Africans did lose more than 17 aircraft that day, and in the area that Marseille operated. Tate also reveals 20 RAF single-engine fighters and 1 twin-engined fighter were destroyed and several others severely damaged, as well as a further USAF P-40 shot down. However, Overall, Tate reveals that Marseille's kill total comes close to 65, a €70% corroboration, indicating as many as 50 of his claims may not have been actually kills. Tate also compares Marseille's rate of corroboration with the top 6 P-40 pilots. While only the Canadian James Francis Edwards records shows a verification of 100%, other aces like Clive Caldwell, Billy Drake, John Lloyd Waddy and Andrew Barr are at the same order of magnitude as Marseille's claims. Christopher Shaw's and Hans Ring also support Tate's conclusions. British historian Stephen Bungay gives a figure of 20 Allied losses that day. However, the claims for September 15, 1942 are in serious doubt, following the first detailed scrutiny of the records of individual Allied squadrons by Australian historian Russell Brown. Moreover, Brown lists 3 occasions on which Marseille could not have downed as many aircraft as claimed. Stephen Bungay has pointed out the low military value of shooting down DAF fighters, rather than the bombers that, by mid-1942, were having a highly damaging effect on Axis ground units and convoy routes. Referring to September 1, 1942, Bungay points out that even if Marseille shot down 15 of the 17 he claimed that day, the rest of the 100 or so German fighter pilots between them only got 5. The British, SIG, lost no bombers at all. During this period the DAF lost only a few bombers, but all fell to anti-aircraft offences, and evidence shows that Rommel was forced onto the defensive because of the losses inflicted by bombers. Summary of career. Decorations. Sometime in the early 1990s, one of Marseille's biographers, Robert Tate, visited the former Marseille Case and Base and Museum to see and photograph Marseille's medals. When he arrived, Tate was informed the Knight's Cross, oak leaves, swords and diamonds belonging to Marseille had already been stolen. Wehrmacht Bericht references Dates of rank Hans-Joachim Marseille joined the military service in Wehrmacht on November 7, 1938. His first station was Quedlinburg in the Herz region, where he received his military basic training as a Luftwaffe recruit. Stations of operation Hans-Joachim Marseille, after he had completed his training at the Jagdleiterschule 5, was assigned to the Erger-Currentsiensangstjagdtrupp Mersberg stationed at the airport in Mersberg West. Erger-Currentsiensangstjagdtrupp Mersberg, I. JAGD/LG2, 2. JG52, I. JG27. Absence from the Geschwader. Marseille and his environment. Several biographers of Hans-Joachim Marseille have written about his disdain for authority and for the National Socialist movement in general. This first came to the fore in the movie, The Star of Africa, the fictionalized 1957 movie about his life, which described an incident that occurred shortly after Marseille was presented the swords to the Knight's Cross. The young Oberleutnant, while on visit in Germany, was presented with evidence of the final solution. Shocked by this information, he did not return to North Africa but went into hiding in Italy instead. Only after the Gestapo established his whereabouts and pressured him did he return to his Geschwader. Further research by other biographers has unearthed some truth to this story and his attitude to the ruling Nazi movement. Marseille demonstrated his lack of respect for the Nazi elite during his visit to Germany in June-August 1942. Marseille was a gifted pianist and was invited to play a piece at the home of Willy Messerschmitt, an industrialist and designer of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter Marseille had achieved so much success in. Guests at the party included Adolf Hitler, party chairman Martin Bormann, Hitler's deputy and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Gar Paragraph Ring, head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler and Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels. After impressing with a display of piano play for over an hour, including Ludwig van Beethoven's Fa 1/4 Elise, Marseille proceeded to play American jazz, which was considered degenerate in Nazi ideology. Hitler stood, raised his hand, and said, "I think we've heard enough," and left the room. Magda Goebbels found the prank amusing and Arthur Axmann recalled how his blood froze when he heard this ragtime music being played in front of the Fa 1/4. Later that month Marseille was invited to another function, despite his stunt. Obergruppen für 1/4 Rare Karl Wolf, Perser Paragraph Nurture Stab Reich für 1/4 Rare SS to the Reich für 1/4 Rare SS Heinrich Himmler, confirmed that during his visit Marseille overheard a conversation which mentioned the mistreatment of Jews. He stated, Globoknik and I were talking about Operation Rheinwald, which was in full effect following Heydrich's murder, and also the construction of Soberbench Blinker. I know I asked him about Haar Paragraph SS, who was also standing there and had been summoned by Himmler regarding logistics or something regarding the new camp. Then Globoknik mentioned to me and Kaltenbrunner that Lidis had been cleared, and all the Jews and Czechs had been dealt with. I noticed that this young pilot, who I later learned was Marseille, must have overheard, and I debated whether I should go over and say something to him. I decided against it. When Marseille returned to his unit he asked his friends Franziskit, Clade and Schra whether they had heard what was happening to Jews and if perhaps something was underway that they did not know about. Franziskit recalled that he had heard Jews were being relocated to territory gained in the east but no more. Marseille recounted how he had attempted to ask questions about Jews who had vanished from his neighborhood, including the family doctor that had delivered him at birth. Regardless of his hero status, when he attempted to bring the subject into any conversation with people who approached him, his inquiries were either met with awkward silences, or people changed the subject or even turned away. Franziskit noticed a change in Marseille's attitude towards his nation's cause. He never spoke of this with his comrades again. References =footnotes =citations =bibliography External links Hans-Joachim Marseille in the German National Library Catalogue, Robert 8, USAF. Hans-Joachim Marseille. Luftwaffe Resource Center. Retrieved January 13, 2014. Hans-Joachim Marseille, the most amazing fighter pilot of World War II. Inches. World War II. Retrieved January 13, 2014. Wilhelm Ratuszynski. Hans-Joachim Marseille, Desert Eagle. WW2A Stories. Retrieved January 13, 2014. Hans-Joachim Marseille. World War II Awards. Retrieved January 13, 2014.